I'm Robert Day, President and CEO of Ceres Global Ag Corp.
From a supply chain perspective specifically, what does an international company like Ceres Global Ag Corp look for when considering investing in a foreign country?
It starts with the strategy and what makes sense from a strategic standpoint and the size of opportunity. That's sort of what gets you through the first layer. Beyond that, we're looking to see what is the efficiency and the infrastructure available in that country. Is it a place that we can go and we can operate effectively and efficiently? And then, I think perhaps the most important thing is what's the environment in that country? Is it a law-abiding culture? Is it a rules-based society? What is dispute resolution like? And what's the work ethic of the people in that country? And really, is it a place that we can work consistent with our values as a company? We have a significant amount of operations in Canada. Canada is really a company that's rich with commodity resources. So it's very well suited for our industry and the things that we're doing. The other thing is, while you read a lot of press about the Canadian railroads and some of the criticisms about it, Canada is really quite efficient when it comes to the movement of goods out to the coast and outside the country. And so it certainly is when you compare it to other countries around the world. So that's something that definitely is in Canada's favor. The other thing is, I would say generally Canada is consistent in its policies. And it's a predictable type of an economy and an environment, and so it lends itself well for that. And then lastly, it is a rules-based economy and a strong work ethic type of a culture. We have a lot of business in Western Canada. We have that experience. People that operate in that environment are very committed individuals. It's not an easy place to work and live at times, given the weather. And it's a very resilient society. And so Canada lends itself very well to that sort of thing.
You mentioned your investments in Western Canada. I think you made one during the pandemic in Saskatchewan.
That's correct. We had an opportunity to acquire an elevator from Cargill up in northern Saskatchewan. It's a facility that's really in the heart of oat country, and oats is a very important product line for Ceres Global. And so we were able to execute that transaction through the pandemic. And I think the counterparty we were dealing with is professional and organized, and it worked out quite well.
What are some of the logistical challenges with cross-border trade, and how can global companies work to overcome them?
First, I'd say, typically when you're dealing with cross-border trade, you encounter additional modes of logistics, whether that's vessels or it's different kinds of trains, things like that. So those are things to consider. They're certainly not obstacles that can't be overcome, and they can be opportunities, quite frankly. The other thing that can be, just to consider is there's quite a lot in the form of administration and let's call it trade considerations. So things like phytosanitary permits, tariffs, and maybe the consistency or the inconsistency of the rules and practices, depending on the relationship that the governments in between countries have. And then there's also counterparty risks. So lots of things to consider that add complexity to an international supply chain, but it's really it can be an opportunity as well. I think that the thing that global companies can do to make those things easier to deal with is to be organized as an industry and to be represented as an industry in front of those governments. So things like NIAGA and GAFTA and these types of associations allow us to come together as an industry and partner with government so that we can minimize these challenges that we have in moving products across border.
Of course, the elephant in the room in terms of trade between Canada and the US is CUSMA from our perspective and USMCA from yours. How do these kinds of trade agreements, and this one in particular, impact our cross-border supply chains?
The longer that these agreements are in place, the easier and the better they are, because there's a few reasons. So there's just a level of predictability and certainty that comes when an agreement is in place, as long as, for example, NAFTA, and then transitioning to this new acronym, whatever you want to call it. it certainly has a lot of look and feel of NAFTA, and so there's a tremendous amount of comfort in that area when it comes to investing in infrastructure and making the supply chain more efficient. The other thing is, and I don't think this gets talked about much, is you notice there's a familiarity amongst government officials in the countries when these types of agreements are in place, and their ability to resolve differences or just get aligned on policy that's going to be more impactful and better for the industry, it is enhanced over time. And so really, whether it's CUSMA or whatever we want to call it, it's been around for a long time, and it's had a very positive impact on the trade flows. There's still a lot of things that aren't developed yet in our industry as far as trade between the US and Canada. But the things that are developed are quite efficient as a result of that agreement.
Now, of course, Canada and the US share one of the longest demilitarized borders in the world. And I also think that the trade between Canada and the US is number one in the world, two-way trade in terms of total dollars. How resilient would you say is that supply chain and ultimately that trade between Canada and the US?
I think it's extremely resilient. One thing I would say, though, is that, and I mentioned this, in our industry, in the grain and oilseed trade at least, that supply chain is pretty underdeveloped, really. The Canadian Wheat Board era lasted a long time, and we're still very much living in a paradigm of from the Canadian Wheat Board era. And what I mean by that is, you look at the way our industries are structured from a railroad perspective, policies and practices, from a company and infrastructure perspective. We really have Canadian companies in the industry and US companies in the industry. Ceres Global is really kind of an exception to that rule. We are broadly invested on both sides of the border, and that's one of the core aspects of our strategy. But the idea that you will move product into the US from Canada, there are some products that move that way, like oats and rye, but these are smaller, more boutique type products. The bigger, larger volume products really move out to the coasts in Canada, and they're not as competitive moving into the US. The structure of the rail industry is one of the reasons for that. So I think it's from a relationship standpoint, it's extremely resilient. But from an industry standpoint and trade flows and what makes economic sense, there's still opportunity to develop that further. And just a couple of last points on that. It's not very efficient to move product from the US into Canada. And really what's most important there is there could be opportunities to be exporting US products out of Canadian ports. And that's something that is very underdeveloped. And I think that's changing, though. There is an entrant in the Canadian market who's developed a very large infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure, that's opening up new capacity. And so some of these trade flows, I think, have an opportunity to develop and become more resilient, over time. That's kind of where we stand. So there's some really interesting opportunities ahead. I'm talking about G3, and there's others too. So Grains Connect, which is a joint venture between Grain Corp in Australia and Zenograin, and then they have a joint venture with P&H in the Port of Vancouver. So there is some added capacity that's coming on that kind of opens up some of these, new trade flow opportunities.
I want to finish by asking you about the role of a few key stakeholders, and since you were talking about government, let's start with that. What can the Canadian government do to strengthen Canadian supply chains, in your view?
I think the Canadian government has an opportunity to be more proactive than it is today. And I would say that applies both to trade rules and regulations as they relate to Canada and other countries, and how they themselves could help negotiate changes in practices to make it more possible for private industry to move more Canadian products out of Canada or US products through Canada. Things like, where it gets very challenging is there are some countries, most countries don't allow a company like Ceres to commingle US and Canadian origin, even if it's product of the same quality, and in the destination, it would perform extremely well if we did. Some do, and those that do really are doing so as a result of a significant amount of work from private industry or an association like in Niagara, for example, to make that possible. I think Canadian government could be more proactive to understand which countries, which trade flows would benefit if certain countries were to change their rules and regulations around those types of things, and how can they do that? Should they be providing a CGC certification in a US port so that we can have greater flow of Canadian products out of Canada and create more markets for farmers and for other suppliers in Canada?
And then if we look at the role of industry specifically, and in particular the Canadian industry, but potentially as well as, let's say, the American industry, and its key players, what do you see them being able to do, or maybe even what have you been able to do to help strengthen our supply chains?
There's the obvious things like, we can invest in infrastructure and we can provide consistent service to our customers and make sure that, they want to keep coming back for more. But I also think that it's our obligation to bring creative ideas to the market and to government, so government can see what's possible and they can see what the benefit would be if they are proactive. We try really hard to do that and interface with the Canadian government, whether it's at the provincial level or the federal level, so that they can have a vision that we can share, and they can recognize and see what that opportunity is, so they can take the action they need to take, which would allow us to take our action. I feel like from our standpoint, we need to be responding positively to government's efforts to make their economy more efficient. And we can do that by investing. We can do that by running an excellent business and making our customers satisfied. But we also have a role to play in helping government see what we see.